everybody. Thank you so much for coming. It's my honor to be the more or less moderator for this event tonight. Well, you're in for a treat. This is a great book, and I've admired Nick's work for a long time. Let me, Nick, start with just a very straightforward question. You know, if you read the news, maybe Wired magazine, maybe the New York Times, you're always reading about the new thing and how it's going to make our lives better. Usually by making them more convenient or easier, taking away the labor. A good example, for example, is the automated car, the car that drives itself. Everyone's saying, well, once we have the car that drives itself, well, obviously life is going to be so much better. But you have slightly different feelings about that faith in automation.
I do. And on the one hand, you know, it's easy to understand why we're so excited about this and so infatuated about this. I mean, one of the great engineering challenges, one of the great challenges to inventors is always kind of figuring out how to get inanimate objects to do things that we do. And it's always amazing when that happens. It feels like magic. And certainly with the Google self-driving car, it's a perfect example of that, because it wasn't that long ago when experts said there's no way that a computer can drive a car, that you'll have a robotic car. It's something that you need, that kind of human intuition. And as Google has shown, that at least in a lot of circumstances, you can actually get a computer to drive a car. The problem in this view, I think, particularly as it gets operationalized by Silicon Valley, by engineers, by programmers, is that we begin to think that anything that we do that a computer can be designed to do, we should give to the computer. And that runs into both, I think that raises both practical problems and dangers and philosophical or even existential ones. And the practical dangers are that one thing we know about automation is that if you make a person's work too easy, they begin to tune out. They don't pay attention anymore. They put all their faith in the machine. And on those rare occasions when something goes wrong, they make mistakes. But even worse than that is they don't practice their own skills. They don't practice their own talents. And as a result, either don't develop them or those skills get rusty. And that can, you know, have actual practical problems in terms of safety, in terms of efficiency.
Yeah.
And then there's the philosophical side, which is that actually we're happiest, we're most satisfied and most fulfilled when we're working hard at something. And it can be driving a car. A lot of people actually really like to drive a car in this sense that, oh, because the computer can do it, we should let the computer do it, and then we'll go do something else, just doesn't fit with what we actually know about what makes our lives rich, which is actually developing talent and demonstrating talent.
Well, let's just bear down a little bit on this concept of automation, which is the key to your book. The book is about automation, some of the challenges posed by it. Obviously, humans are tool-using creatures, and you know, since the flint axe, we've been having tools through the wheel all the way through. Is there something different about tool using, which has always been part of human, and automation, which is something newer? And what is the real difference between those two ideas?
Well, there's, on the one hand, there's similarities.
Yeah.
You can draw a straight line between going all the way back to, you know, the invention of the wheel and the lever and things. Those are examples of people wanting to somehow make their lives easier in order, not necessarily to relieve themselves of work, but in order to do more.
Yeah.
But I think what's changed is we've moved from a world where automation took mechanical form and hence tended to be limited to physical activities, manual activities that were often repetitive ones, routine ones, to a world where we've switched from the mechanism being the essence of automation to the digital computer. And as soon as you have a digital computer, then automation kind of leaps out of the factory, where most of us think of it being, and moves into professional jobs, white-collar jobs, you know, jobs that suddenly you can automate the evaluation of information, the analysis of information, even judgment making and decision making, but also moves into our own lives. These days when we carry around a smartphone or a tablet, we're constantly going to it for things that I would argue are instances of automation. If you,
Right.
I'll just give one example is, if you're on Facebook and you click a like button, you're automating an aspect of socializing. It used to be if you'd liked a movie or a book or something, a magazine article or something, you'd have to make the effort to call someone or meet someone at a bar or something and say, hey, I really like this and this is why I like it. With the like button, you can click it and kind of broadcast that like. And in a sense, you think, okay, I'm done now.
Right.
And so, there might be good things about that, there might be bad, but it changes the way we behave, and I think it changes our sense of what it means to be social.
Yeah.
So as automation kind of flows out, kind of imbues everything we do, there are a lot of alterations in behavior and expectations, and so I think just at a simple level, the effects are much broader than they ever were before.
Right. Well, one, I think the benefits of automation seem very intuitive and obvious to us. Mowing the grass using an electric mower is a lot different than doing with a pair of scissors, let's say, for example. But you focus on the costs, and in your book, you point out some of the costs are not merely sort of existential, life flight, but actually real human costs, planes crashing or people dying GPS. Why don't you give some examples or jobs lost?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the area of aviation is one of the best ones to look at because the airline business started to be automated with computers many years ago, early 1980s. We started to see a shift from mechanical autopilot systems that ran on gyroscopes, basically, to computers being programmed to fly the plane. And by now, we're at a stage where really you can fly an airliner completely with computers. Still, the pilot tends to be involved a little bit. I think the estimate is maybe 3 minutes of manual control for an average airliner flight, about 1.5 minutes on takeoff.
Is that it? 3 minutes the whole time?
And 1.5 minutes on landing, assuming nothing goes wrong.
Right.
And first of all, I should say that that doesn't mean flying is unsafe. We all know that flying is much, much safer than it used to be. And in fact, through the main history of aviation automation, things got better. Things got safer. Flying got more efficient. But what's happened recently is that we see signs that we probably have gone too far. And 3 minutes probably isn't enough. And what happens is a couple of things. One is that pilots become complacent. So if you're not called on to do things, to interact with the world, to look out and see where you are, then your mind drifts. I mean, we're very distractible. Human beings are very distractible. And the second thing that happens is you begin to lose skills, because one thing we know about skill is it comes through practice. It doesn't come through looking at a computer screen to see data about flight speed and stuff. It actually comes from holding the controls. And so when those rare occasions when something goes wrong, when the autopilot cuts out, we see increasing evidence that pilots will make a mistake. And you can understand why. They're kind of spaced out. Their skills are a little rusty, and all of a sudden, they have to grab, usually when this happens, there's weather problems or there's something challenging, and they make mistakes. And I talk in the book about a couple of major accidents. In 2009, there was a crash, as I'm sure you'll remember, of a commuter plane in Buffalo, and there was the major crash of a Air France jet in the Atlantic going from Brazil to Paris. And the amazing thing is, when you look at what happened, in both cases, it's very, very similar. The autopilot system cut out in the Buffalo case because the plane was about to go into an aerodynamic stall. In the Air France case, because the airspeed sensors on the outside of the plane had been caked with ice, therefore the computer wasn't getting data. Without data, the computer can't do anything, so it just cuts off. And the pilots had to take control very quickly. And both of them, instead of doing what their training and their expertise would say, which is push the yoke or the control forward, head down in order to gain airspeed so you don't stall, both of them pulled back, went up, lost more speed, and ultimately the plane went into a stall and in both cases crashed and killed everyone on board. those are both examples, it's pretty clear, of what researchers into automation call automation complacency. That there are big problems if you don't practice enough. And so last year, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, sent out an alert to airlines saying, you know, we strongly suggest you get pilots to spend a little more time manually flying the plane. And so I think this is, in some case, a model and a metaphor for what we're all going through now as we come to depend more and more on computers to do all sorts of things. And it's not that automation is bad, it's just you have to be very careful in how you design it, because if you take too much control and too much responsibility away from the human being, you start to get problems.
Well, I'll get back in a second to what it does to us, but one thing that struck me reading this part about the airline pilots, you know, growing up, I always thought airline pilots, they look great, big hats and everything. I sort of thought of them as very fancy, but they're not paid very well. Increasingly poorly paid, maybe because they're only doing 3 minutes of work an hour, or every actually less than that, right? 3 minutes of work. They're like the designated hitter, although I guess they're paid well. But you know, they only do, for whatever reason, the computer is doing almost all the work. And if you're saying this is a metaphor for the future, you know, to the extent, how real is the danger that as computers take over more and more of the economy? I mean, it sounds like such a 19th century thing, that in some sense humans get pushed out, and the jobs that humans do are both not only meaningless, but also poorly paid.
I think we see signs of it already. I mean, look, you're a lawyer. Look in the law profession, and you may know more about this than I do, but the whole process.
We don't have robot judges yet, but some of them feel like robots.
The whole process of evidence discovery, the discovery process, which until recently meant having quite a few people, smart people, junior lawyers, paralegals, reading through reams and reams of documents, looking for evidence, trying to, you know, piece together what happened and stuff. More and more, that's done by computers, because computers are very, very good at reading, quote unquote, huge amounts of text very, very quickly, and they can be increasingly programmed to pick up signs of, you know, relationships between people, even emotions in that people express through text and stuff. And so I think that's a good example that actually, you know, there are what seem to be very sophisticated skills that require not just, you know, moving a control, but actually thinking through stuff. That can now be turned over to computers. And you know, going a little further in the legal profession, there's a startup out of Stanford that combines Stanford law professors with Stanford computer scientists that is looking actually to mine kind of, you know, case history in order to suggest particular strategies. This is in patent law, basically. So you know, when should you settle? What kind of offer should you settle? Where should you try to have the trial and stuff? And so that doesn't mean that computers are going to take over all of the jobs by any means. But I think what we're finding out is there are a lot of even white-collar jobs where we used to employ a lot of people that actually can be adequately replicated by a well-programmed computer. And the challenge, the economic challenge, I think, is in the past when you had the mechanization of factory work, there were some good skilled workers that lost their jobs, but through various economic and social processes, it opened up a lot more jobs. Or there were new categories of work, white-collar work, professional work, that were created and also linked to the expansion of the middle class. We haven't seen that with computer automation yet. And this has been going on for a couple of decades now. And so the question becomes, will this break the pattern of the past where automation always led to the creation of more jobs? The question is, as more skills can be automated, what skills remain that can employ a lot of people in middle-class jobs?
Although I guess the comeback would be, you know, you mentioned in the law, which I know a little bit about, that computers read huge amounts of documents, find the one phrase better than humans do. I got to say, that's a pretty boring job. You know, like going through a mountain of paper and trying to find every time the word automation is mentioned or something. I mean, that's, and farming in the old days, laborious, you know, if we're thinking about even older examples. So, I mean, it wouldn't have come back and saying, well, you know, what we're doing is getting rid of things that humans don't want to do so they can focus on the things. And if, you know, there's less work, well, then people can spend more time playing golf or, you know, or fishing or other sort of leisure activities, that maybe this is what's called advanced when we get the robots to do the grunt work, so to speak. And what would you say to that?
I would say in the best cases, that's true. That you have, you figure out routine work that people aren't that happy doing, whether it's, you know, digging a ditch with a shovel or reading through documents for a phrase, and then you automate that, and then those people hopefully can get other employment and do more interesting things. And if it works like that, then everybody wins.
Right.
The problem is it doesn't always work like that. In this sense that anytime we automate something, a task, we free people up to rise to a higher level of effort is, I think, a fantasy. And it's often used, you hear it used all the time by people who have become very wealthy through automation, through running the servers and making the software. Well, people are going to lose their jobs, but, you know, in the long run, they're going to be freed to rise to higher levels of achievement. In fact, what we're seeing now is that there aren't actually higher levels of achievement that are possible. If you're a pilot, and a pilot is, you know, a skilled professional, and the computer takes over most of the aspects of flight, you know, not only the autopilot function, but determining the course and everything else. Well, what are you lifted up to? You're actually more and more turned into a computer operator, somebody who watches screens, who enters data into them. If you're a primary care physician and suddenly you're required or you want to use a computer to keep records of patients, and that program also includes templates that tell you how to go through, essentially push you in a certain direction to go through an exam, what you should do, enter in this information, click these checkboxes, and then ultimately, you know, suggest a diagnosis and even a method of treatment. Well, where does the primary care physician, how does that raise the primary care physician to a higher level? The primary care physician becomes a kind of computer operator who's entering stuff into screens. And I think what we see as automation spreads is more and more jobs that used to be very, entailed distinctive talents, kind of that required a lot of either psychomotor skills or lots of experience that bred intuition about situations. Those jobs, more and more, the people are turning into computer operators.
Right.
And so there's still cases where you can point to, well, this allowed this person to rise up to a higher level of thinking or whatever, but to assume that simply by automating things, everybody's going to jump up and, you know, become artists or whatever underestimates the fact that, you know, when a computer steals your job or turns your job from something interesting to something less interesting, there may be no other place for you to go.
Right. Well, the word you use in your book, which I think is a really interesting book, is the concept of miswanting, miswants, and even just moving away. Does this represent? Can you explain that concept of miswant and how maybe at a society level it's presenting these challenges you're discussing?
So that, you know, what I just talked about is kind of the practical economic job issue. And then there's something deep inside us, something deep in our psychological makeup that leads us as individuals to think that we want to be freed up, and also ties into this. There was a very interesting study done in the 1980s where researchers from the University of Chicago tracked a bunch of people as they went through their day. And people had beepers, if you remember beepers before smartphones. This is when only,
before smartphones.
I mean, before cell phones. This is when only very wealthy executives had cell phones. And so they gave these people beepers, and randomly the beeper would go off and they'd have to kind of write down what they were doing, how they felt, what skills they were using. And the research found a very interesting conclusion, which is that when people were at work, they wanted to get off the job. They wanted to be at leisure. They wanted, you know, the end of the workday to come so they could go home and whatever. And when they were at leisure, the last thing they wanted was to go back to work. But then when you looked at their satisfaction levels, they were felt much more satisfied, much more fulfilled, much more content when they were at work. And then when they were at leisure, their satisfaction levels went way down. And the researchers term this the paradox of work, that we seem to want to be freed from hard effort, from challenging tasks, and yet that's when we feel best. That's when we're kind of relieved of self-absorption and anxiety. It's those moments when we're tackling some hard challenge, it can be any kind, we're immersed in the work, we're pushing our skills to the limit. And this seems to be a broader manifestation of what psychologists call miswanting, that sometimes we want the things that make us unhappy and don't want things that make us happy. And this plays right into automation. And I think it's why in our personal lives we're so quick to adopt any gadget or any app that says, oh, I'll do this for you. I'll get you from point A to point B, or I'll suggest the next book you wanna read. We say, oh, great, that's going to give me more time to be bored and anxious, and so there's these kind of broad socioeconomic trends, but there's something within us too that often leads us to, as I write in the book, it often means that automation frees us from that which makes us feel free. In those, you put all those together, and there's a lot of momentum to simply go down this path.
I mean, you paint a picture of a future. It's kind of bleak where, basically every job is reading email. And I mean, how many jobs are really actually email and forwarding email? I can't tell you how much every day I spend trying to find some email from 3 months ago and forwarding it. Like, it's more than my job, I'd like to admit. It's kind of embarrassing. But there's something very deep here, which you're trying to capture in this book, which I would describe as this sense that even as we succeed and become more powerful in our technological abilities, that in the process of using those to try and pull away all the discomforts of life, all the inconveniences, that somewhere along the line we're losing what it means to be human and losing some of the most satisfying parts of being human. I just want to throw an example that this made me think of. We were talking about this a little backstage, is when you think about how many of the things we've developed are our life habits to avoid inconvenience or frustrations or challenges. And then you ask people what their most rewarding hobbies are. And there are things like golfing, which could not be more frustrating. You and I both like fishing. Fishing is basically sitting around for hours bored. It sounds like, if it wasn't called fishing, you would try to avoid it. And because you'd be like, oh my God, I got to sit. If it was at work, you'd be like, I got to sit in this boat for hours on end, while like once every 3 hours, maybe 20 minutes if you're lucky, something exciting happens for a second and then it's nothing, and then it gets tangled and I got to clip things and all these things people call their hobby. Cooking is it's challenging. Half the time the food burns or doesn't work out well, and then family's not happy. So, the things that people are the most treasured hobbies are actually kind of frustrating and challenging and difficult. Right. And you're saying we're kind of like pulling these, almost unconsciously pulling these things out of our lives. Is that part of what you're talking about?
That's right. I mean, if you think about the ideal automated world, and this is, a scenario that's been around for years and years, very popular today. Machines take over everything, and then we can spend all our time on the hobbies we like. Right. And if we actually did that, forgetting about how you're going to redistribute all this wealth that is being generated, so everybody can do this. But forgetting that, if we actually did that, if we had the discipline and stuff to actually engage in interesting hobbies or even boring ones that we like, that would be one thing. But even the things we really like to do, we often don't do them because it's kind of too much effort. And so if you come out with an app that, in fishing, that lets you, have sonar, whatever you use for under the water, radar for under the water, fishermen, even amateur fishermen will say, oh, let's automate this whole process, and then we can know where the fish are and stuff. And you kind of, even at that level, we have this desire to make things easier and kind of take away what actually probably was what we enjoyed in the first place.
Right, no, it's so true. And we should move on to questions, but I'll make another confession. I said, I was thinking about how often I try to avoid, walking places and trying to get in a taxi or get in a subway, Yet among my hobbies, it says hiking. I'm like, what? Yet I'm always like, oh man, I gotta find how to get here. Anyway, I think we're gonna move to questions. I think I can kind of see people. Do we need to use a microphone, or do they just ask? Well, why don't we start with this gentleman here in the front?
You were talking about automated cars, and I was thinking, people used to walk, and then they rode horses, and then we got trains, and it wasn't so terrible. And when you mentioned it, I thought, supposing you could get into a car, and you just punched in your destination, and the car would take you there. Of course, it would do away with Jaguars and Lamborghinis and all of these fancy cars, and maybe they'd all be electric, but it would be certainly, from the standpoint of the planet, it could be a very beneficial thing to have happen. And I speak of this because I love driving. I've driven over several continents, but I think from the standpoint of society, it could be a very, very beneficial thing, not just something that would sort of relieve you of some onerous task, but rather that could reformulate society in a better, more less endangering to the climate. That would be one example. And the other thing I thought of is the idea of trying to stop technology is like standing in the shore and telling the waves not to come in. The real answer is that you've got to find some way to do it creatively because the waves are going to come in.
Right. And I think that's absolutely right. I'm not talking about stopping technology or going back to some ideal pre-automated world, which has never existed so long as human beings have been making tools. I think what I'm interested in is not that, but to say if we're going to use computers and more to automate more and more tasks, how can we do this wisely? How can we do this in a way that keeps people fulfilled and satisfied and in interesting jobs, and also make sure that we continue to protect unique human skills that computers can't replicate? The ability to have ingenious, witty thoughts, to think conceptually, creatively, critically. As automation kind of takes hold, there's always a tendency to say, well, what matters is what we can measure in terms of cost or in terms of efficiency. And if we go too far in that direction, then we begin to lose those unique skills, unique human skills. So I think there is a different path we could take. Right now, the dominant design philosophy in automation is what's called technology-centered design, which basically means the programmer or the engineer begins by saying, what can the computer do? And then everything the computer can do, you give to the computer, and then anything left over goes to the human being. And what's left over tends to be things like monitoring screens, entering data, and taking over in an emergency. Things that actually people are really bad at. And another, a different model is what's called human-centered design, where you start not by looking at the computer or the machinery, but you look at the person and say, what are people good at here? And what aren't they so good at doing? And let's use the computer to fill in the gaps, to challenge the human, to bring new information to bear that the person might not have, but not to take over stuff just willy-nilly, but to create this better partnership where the strengths of the computer and the strengths of the human being can be put together. And I think that's hard to do because there's a lot of momentum that, particularly if you look at companies, they want to save labor costs, get efficiency, get productivity, and involving the human a little more sometimes means sacrificing some of that. So I'm not saying that this would be easy to do, but I completely agree with you that the big challenge is not stopping this, but thinking about how do we do it wisely rather than rashly.
Can I weigh on that question? This is my own opinion, someone who thinks about these things sometimes. I think we're at a big turning point with technology where we have spent the last, 2,000, maybe 5,000 years dealing with some very basic challenges of scarcity, like not enough food, shelter, just the real basics. And they are real challenges, and it's not as if they have been easy to overcome, and we have not overcome them for all the world, but in some of the richer parts of the world we have started to, not for everybody, but for at least parts of it. And I think we're reaching a period where, as you say, we've been so focused on just trying to make things easier, less laborious, faster, go forward, and kind of blindly moving with technology that we may need to think about how, if technologies, as you say, are kind of carving out, even if it's easier and life is not as painful, whether we're losing the meaning in it. And it's very subtle, you know, and some of these practical things like airplane crashes, but some of it really does require you to confront these existential questions of what is life like, and does it have any meaning not to have challenges in life? And they aren't easy questions to ask, and I'm glad that you're here to ask them. This gentleman here in the front. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could comment on technology affecting education and how you see education changing. I'm in the field of education, but I think about things from, you know, the flipped classroom where, okay, lots of teachers are not good at lecturing, so let's just have the Khan Academy teach us how to do math, you know. Go home and watch Salman Khan teach you to integrate or differentiate. You know, in higher ed, there's the MOOCs. You know, I spend too much of my time grading papers, which is very tedious, and people fantasize about a program that can grade a paper better than a human. I don't believe you could ever make such a program, but it would be nice if there were one.
This is the instinct everybody has, you know.
Some of my students are here hearing this. But thoughts on education and how technology is changing that field?
I do have some thoughts on that, and I'm sure that Tim, as an educator, has perhaps more subtle ones than I do. But I think every new kind of communication technology changes education in some way. And always in the beginning, there's this sense that this is going to completely change education. The classroom's going to disappear. And we saw that with the mail system, you know, correspondence education, with TV, with radio. Every time you get the same thing that we've seen with MOOCs, which is that there's something basically flawed about classrooms and about our whole system, and now we can junk it and become much more efficient and you know, much more personalized in a way by having software personalize things. And it never works because there actually is something to classrooms, to kind of the somewhat inefficient old modes of education that we tend to underestimate because they're very hard to measure. And this comes back to that theme that, you know, as we push forward on automation, we tend to focus more on the things that can be measured. And so my own feeling is that computers are going to play a valuable role in education. In fact, some of the best software, I think the software that kind of engages people, can be seen in the educational arena, where you are trying to keep people attentive, keep them learning, and so forth. But I don't think, and I think it would be a mistake to go further, that the computer can take over the skills of a teacher without losing something very, very important.
Thank you. Yeah, I might, if that's all right to just add, I'm a professor at Columbia, and so I teach for a living. And when I'm not running for office, stuff like that. And I have, I think I've lived through this sort of computer becoming such more of a modern thing, automating of education. And my emphasis has been to go, and I'm not speaking, to go in the exact opposite direction. I consider myself part of a movement, which you're part of, is to return very fundamentally to what are the human parts that can't be replicated. So I assume that the students have all the information imaginable, can get, in my case, can get all the cases, all the law, whatever it is. It's not like I deliver that to them. So I focus very much on the human parts. Computers are completely banned. Students have to stand up and speak. I interrogate them one-on-one, because that's what I think is scarce. I think information is everywhere. You can get that easily. What's hard is to have someone drilling you and pretending that you're like a lawyer defending a case. That's not an easy experience to get. And I think in the future that we need to really orient on what the human parts are and focus in education. And I can't say what that is as a general rule, but to the extent that I think educators are adding value, it's teaching human skills and not simply educate, you know, here's some information, because the information is there and they're going to get it. This woman in the front.
Sorry, one more education question.
Sure, that's fine.
I work with younger kids. I'm a tutor, and I'm very old-fashioned myself, and I have these sort of, I guess, very outdated ideas about important skills. You know, something basic like, you know, calculation, being able to do calculations in your head rather being able to spell, or any of these things that all of these kids can now do, research, find information, it's all at their fingertips. And I'm just curious, I'm constantly trying to think what, and I don't think a lot of education for younger kids has really caught up. What are the skills that we should be trying to now teach or enhance? Because I myself feel a little bit lost sometimes in terms of what can I teach these kids that they can get really easily, and what's actually going to be useful for them. I just wondered if you had any.
Sure. I've been asked to repeat the question, so I'll sort of try to repeat it, which is the questioner is a tutor. She says that she is old school, has an old school kind of approach, likes to teach basic skills, but wonders really what kind of skills she should be teaching. Is that a fair, and finds that it's a really challenging question in today's times.
Yeah, and I'm not a teacher, so I'm not going to be able to give a perfect answer to this. But I don't think we should underestimate the need to develop basic skills in some areas. And I think that the example of the calculator, which is something I touch on in the book, is a very good example of how automation can be done well or automation can be done poorly. Because with a calculator, if you automate with a calculator skills that a student has already mastered, then that does free the student to rise up to higher levels of mathematical thinking and expertise. But it depends on having that mastery at every step up. The alternative way to use a calculator is to say, oh, you don't have to learn these basic skills anymore because the machine can do it for you. And rather than freeing you up to rise up, that cuts you off from higher knowledge often, because the higher knowledge builds on lower level expertise. And so I think, to me, that's a model that you want to use automation to automate what someone has already mastered. And so for that person, it becomes routine, and then to hand it over to the machine means that they can then spend more time thinking bigger thoughts, going on to higher level learning. Whereas if you just bring in the automation to bypass that deep learning, then you never push the student up. So to me, I would say we have to be wary about saying that anything a computer can do, a student doesn't need to learn to do, because often what you are doing is you're narrowing the student's long-term horizons if basic knowledge is necessary to lead to higher level knowledge.
Right. Lots of questions. How about in the back? Yeah, I think there's a woman in the back. Yes.
Hi. So this is sort of a two-part question. One is I'm sort of curious about since automation also in a lot of ways has been beneficial, like you recognize as well, and also the fact that I think I've read somewhere, I can't cite exactly where, but that driving a car, for example, is much more dangerous than being in an airplane, and there are many other factors. So what would be the relationship also between automation and the hierarchy of needs and the benefits that that has caused? And also what I'm understanding in a way and deducting from this is that maybe what we should move towards would be more social emotional intelligence and regulation in a lot of ways, because part of automation isn't something that we're going to necessarily stop or be able to control. It's sort of going off on its own. So what would be your opinions on those two aspects?
So I think, I'm supposed to.
Oh yeah, go, yeah.
I
Gives me time to think.
Yeah, no. So the first question was related to the hierarchy of needs. Is that a fair summary? And the second question, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the second question was whether we need to develop more social intelligence. Was that with the social emotional intelligence? Right.
If we're going to have things that are automated and in that sense have more free time or not have to think about what we're doing, there's also the social emotional part that we need to feel important enough that if you're driving a plane, for example, and you only have 3 minutes of work, you should feel that responsibility that you are responsible for all these lives, and you should, sort of be ready at any time.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, that's
So let me just repeat that one more time for
Yeah.
the broadcasters, which is, do we need to develop a kind of different, I'm sort of interpreting it, the social economic set of skills in a future where, for example, a pilot only needs to work 3 hours every 5 hours, that you need sort of different skills to deal with that kind of environment. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's an interesting question because to take the pilot example, the pilot isn't prevented from flying manually more than 3 minutes. For all the reasons we talked about, it's just when you automate things, the pilot, and not all pilots fit this profile, but many do, they'll just do the least amount of work that actually they're called upon. And that's not a criticism of pilots, that's what we all kind of do. And so there are two ways, if that becomes problematical and leads to more dangerous flights in errors that can have profound repercussions, there are two ways to deal with it. One is to kind of train the pilot or convince the pilot to actually take more responsibility for that problem and take over from the autopilot frequently during the course of a flight in order to keep their situational awareness up and their skills, honed and practiced. The other way to address that is to change the way automation works. So instead of the automation simply, you can turn on the autopilot and sit back and not do anything, you can actually program the automated systems to transfer responsibility at certain intervals, unexpected intervals, back to the pilot. So the pilot knows that every now and then the autopilot system is going to say, now you take over for a while. But the pilot doesn't know when that's going to happen, and that actually is a very good way to keep people's situational awareness up, to keep them trained. So I think you can probably use a mix of those type of things, training responsibility to know the flaws that happen when things become over-automated. And I think this is very important when it comes to cars, which are becoming more and more automated, even short of total automation. It's very important to teach people responsible ways to use the automation, and then there's other ways that you can actually program the machine.
This is a serious challenge. I mean, when I say about it, I was just thinking, so the autopilot, the pilot, it's not like he can pick up a book, right? Like, what is he or she do?
Well, they kind of can.
Oh, they can? They just
remember that Northwest flight where they overflew the airport because they were goofing off on their iPads? I mean, you can actually
Oh, I see, okay.
do that.
Oh, I see. And so when we're doing these, I know that they don't exist, the self-driving cars aren't available to the public, but are people just sitting in them, you like to read a book, or you have to sort of be there? But that's even more boring than driving. Can you imagine you're sitting there like waiting for, I just think that's a real crisis.
I mean, what Google wants you to do is to use your smartphone and Google stuff and see their ads, and that, I think that's one of the inspirations. But with self-driving cars, you can't do that because you
have to be ready, right?
You have to be ready.
It's so much worse than driving.
Right.
You're just sitting there, maybe I'm gonna, it's exactly what you're talking about, which is like, it just empties life of any interest. You're just sitting there, okay, I'm not really driving. I'm already not shifting gears.
Yeah.
In case something goes wrong, I'm like the backup. It's so,
Yeah. I can't,
it's such a,
I can't pull out a sketch pad and do art because I have to.
I'm never going to buy one of these cars. I thought the idea you could go in the back and like sleep or something, but you can't do that. You can't just like go in the back and go to sleep. You got to be sitting there on backup.
Right.
Yeah. All right. So more questions. Sorry, I got fired up. This gentleman here in front of you. Yeah.
Give me the car with the massage chair and
Yeah, but then you'll fall asleep. Yeah.
I want to get your opinion on sort of the mid-ground, not automation, but augmentation.
Oh, yeah.
The equivalent of using power tools, because I'm refinishing a slab of walnut, and I well know what I need to do, but that little Bosch sander is actually a pretty damn good thing to have right now to augment my ability. What is your opinion of like especially as we start putting more AI and machine learning, and the equivalent of cognitive power tools as sort of as sort of a future, as opposed to this binary, it's all done by the computer or it's all done by you. Because I realize what your rhetorical device is, but I'd like to kind of explore a little bit of the middle ground.
Do you want to?
Yeah, I might talk about this myself, even though he's the one. I am fascinated.
It's okay.
Well, unless you want to talk about it. But I'm fascinated by human augmentation. I think all tools are human augmentation. So happens, I think that what's happening is we're evolving very quickly with human augmentation, and what we need to do is choose the augmentations with an eye towards what makes life meaningful as we overcome some of the more basic challenges of like scarcity. And I don't know, that would be my very quick answer.
Yeah.
And you are the author here, so I'll try and
I
myself
think
a little more.
the example of power hand tools is very interesting because just to give some historical perspective, back in the 50s, automation back then was very controversial, just as it is now. And there were all these government studies. And there was one very interesting study by a professor at Harvard Business School who went into a bunch of factories and kind of marked out the relationship between automation and skill development. And what he found is, and he had these 18 levels of automation. And the first level was going from hand tools to power hand tools. And that was the only level at which skill requirements went up. Because people still had to have a deep knowledge of the wood or the metal they were working with, but they also now had to figure out how to use this new tool that had power, and so they had to actually be more attentive because if they made a mistake, the cost was much bigger. Every layer up from there, he saw de-skilling happen. More and more skill went into the machine, less and less was held by the worker. So I think your analogy is great. You know, what are the intellectual equivalents of power hand tools? And one, I've sometimes criticized.
Caffeine, sorry.
I've sometimes criticized Google in the past, but I think good search engines might be an example of that, where instead of spending 4 days searching for the piece of information you need in order to weave it together with other information to create bigger thoughts or whatever, you can find that information very, very quickly. So that might be one example.
I think most computers are human. Actually, in the history of computing, there was a big turning point in the 50s and 60s where they went away from trying to build AI. I mean, they still tried, but they essentially never really built great AIs, that is, like R2-D2 or robots, and they started trying to build cognitive augmentation devices. So I think even without noticing it, most computers and most apps are actually augmentation devices. For example, humans do not have great memories, but we have things like I bet, who here has all the phone numbers in their iPhone memorized or their phone memorized? No, right? So the computer's augmenting your memory. You can't keep track of who your friends are, so you have Facebook. You can't spell, so you've got like word processing with so-and-so. And in fact, you can't write that fast, so you have the keyboard at all. Almost everything in the computer, I think, is a form of cognitive augmentation. And there's, that is what, and it's supposed to make us smarter. I'm not sure if it always does, but it's supposed to be. That's what I
just one quick comment about, you mentioned spell check.
Right.
I think spell check was actually a very good tool in its original form, because what it did is you'd type along and it would say, hey, take a look at this word. I think you've made a mistake. And you'd look at it and you'd correct it and you'd learn how to spell. Then we went to autocorrect, where you're just typing along and the machine is correcting everything and it never alerts you to, and there's no learning involved. So it speeds you up and it kind of automatically does things. But that's an example of automation that doesn't encourage you to learn more. It just encourages you to kind of tune out and assume the machine will take care of it. And usually it doesn't matter, but there are those moments of being embarrassed because you've let the computer run wild with your prose.
All right, a lot of excitement. Woman there in the back, yeah. Yes, that's you, yeah, and blonde too.
First, I've been following your work over the years, and I really appreciate it, so thank you. I have a music undergrad and a master's in art education because I wanted to have no money when I grew up. And now I work in tech. I work in the tech world, and I'm just always struck by the huge disparity between, what people make in the tech world versus my friends who are writers and artists and musicians. So in my dream world, automation would help us all become better artists and pursue our dreams of maybe singing or whatever. Probably everyone in this room has some passion or secret wish to be an artist. So my question for you is, how can automation help us maybe embrace the arts more, turn everyone in the world into an artist, and we're all just bartering in the arts? And how can we, instead of just going fishing and playing pool, how can we really, like you said earlier, how can we really do more kind of beneficial stuff with our time with automation?
First of all, I happen to like spending my time fishing, but let me repeat the question. which is to say, if it is the assumption of the question is that it is in the human condition, in our soul, to all want to be artists. And the question is there some way, however, it's very financially challenging for most people to pursue creative artistic endeavors as a career. Can automation play some role in this, particularly given the disparity between the money people make in the tech world and the arts world?
Yeah. Well, I guess I would challenge your assumption that everybody actually wants to be an artist or would be happy being an artist. I think there are all sorts of people who just want to have a good job, actually, and don't. But let's get to the economic question, which is an interesting one, because from the tech world, you'll often hear, and I touched on this earlier, you'll hear this belief that what we're doing is taking away jobs from people, maybe, but we are creating the foundation for a better world in which everybody will be able to be artists, or you won't have to do any labor. And these are people who also have very strong libertarian leanings and are kind of anti-government in many ways, and anti-bureaucracy. And so there's a fundamental tension, even if you assume that that could happen, which I'm very dubious, there's a fundamental tension between this dream that they have, which happens to be quite self-serving because they're the ones who are reaping the rewards of automation and the ability to do huge amounts of tasks that you used to have to pay a lot of workers, but now your computers can do them, and thus more and more profits come to you. So they kind of excuse that by saying, well, sooner or later everybody's going to live in utopia. Well, the challenge to them is, if you're a libertarian, you don't really like government, you like your billions and billions of dollars, tell us how in the future you're going to give that money away to all of the people in order to support so they can eat and have housing and then go on and be painters or singers or whatever. And that's a glaring missing kind of link in the utopian rhetoric of Silicon Valley and of technologists.
Here's a question from online, and then we're going to have one more other question, that'll be it. A question from Sedona, Arizona. What do you hope to have happen as a result of people watching your presentation this evening? Where would we, or do we go from here?
I think at a personal level, it's pretty simple. It's realizing that there are all this momentum and all this pressure to go further and further with automation in a kind of blind fashion, just on the assumption that this is more efficient and better. I think as individuals, we have to recognize that we've gone from a world in which we were automating production to a world in which increasingly we're automating experience. We're automating actually what it's like to live in the world. And I think we should judge automation based on that. So if we're automating experience, we shouldn't use the measures we use to measure automation of production, money and stuff like that. We should look at, how is this going to influence how I live? How is it going to influence how I develop talent or don't develop talent? How is it going to influence my engagement with the physical world, my engagement with one another? And if we determine that actually it's going to make things worse, it's going to impoverish our lives rather than enrich them, then don't go out and buy the new gadget or install the new app, or demand from the software writers a different form of software that actually enriches your life and helps you do more things rather than the opposite. Because software writers, like every other person in business, are going to respond to the market. And so I think we have a personal responsibility to kind of question these things and make thoughtful decisions about the tools we use in our own lives. And then the broader question, which is much more difficult and is hard to deal with at a personal level, is are we kind of always going to be subject to the desire of businesses to eke out any possible efficiency gain by automating all sorts of stuff, even if that ends up eroding the sum total of human talent? And that's a very hard question, and I'm not sure how we go about dealing with that.
Well, I did promise one more, so this will be the last one, this gentleman over here.
All right, to change the word from pressure to automate to pressure to upgrade, I'm curious to know if either of you went ahead and bought the new iPhone.
He wants you.
I did not. But I did, I have an even worse story in some ways. I held off, I didn't buy a smartphone for a long time. 2 weeks ago, I actually broke down and bought a smartphone. It's only a Windows phone, though. I bought the cheapest one possible. And it's quite good, actually. But all my fears about what would happen if I had a smartphone are kind of already coming true. I feel compelled to constantly take it out and look at it, regardless of whether any new important message or information I think is going to come along. It's like I have to look at it. So, but no, at least I didn't buy the new iPhone.
I've still got my 5 here. But I do have one, and it does. I both love it and it drives me crazy. Anyway, on that note, join me in thanking our guests.
Thank you.
Nick.